And the third scenario was ongoing events. So we had them do another task where we had them open up a newsreader and just read some stories. And while they were doing this, we had instrumented the phone for this camera icon to appear. And we chose the camera icon because we thought that that might be a lot more alarming than something else, that they're suddenly being recorded. And then we asked, we observed whether they noticed this and whether they knew that they could expand it to find out more information. Surprisingly, only 3 of the participants noticed this without prompting, which was interesting. But once we prompted them, all of them knew that they can, all but one understood that they could drag it down to figure out what app was responsible for this. So the observations from this was that users expect to find the provenance information where those changes originate. So wallpaper changes, they all went to the settings panel and look at the wallpaper, even though no attribution mechanism actually exists there yet. And for the data usage, they understand to go to the settings panel as well. They're also familiar with the notification bar and know that they can use this to yield more information. So we performed a laboratory experiment, quantitative experiment, where we got 76 Android users to come to the lab, and we gave them a bunch of phones that we instrumented. And the idea was that during the experiment, these devices would start misbehaving, and we wanted to observe whether they would use attribution mechanisms that we wrote on half the phones. The experimental condition had new attribution mechanisms, and whether they'd be more likely to correctly identify the source of these misbehaviors. We also had a control condition where we just gave them the stock Android, which didn't have any of these attribution mechanisms. So the first misbehavior that we looked at was vibration. We chose this because it's an ongoing annoyance, and therefore maybe we could use the notification bar. So we added an icon here in the notification bar. See the icon, then if they expanded it, it would say the name of the app that was currently vibrating the phone. Again, this is only the experimental condition. Otherwise, the only way to correctly identify on the stock Android version, if an app is doing this, is to just go through and randomly kill applications until the vibration stops. The other misbehavior that we looked at was changing the wallpaper. So this is a one-time settings change. We wanted to see whether they would go to the settings panel. And for those in the experimental condition, we added an annotation here. So in this case, it says user, but that was just as easily filled in by the name of the app. So we instrumented the devices, they came to the lab, and we had them do a bunch of subterfuge tasks. So doing security experiments is particularly difficult because most people don't actually do security as the primary task. Sure, we could have had them come to the lab and immediately told them the device is going to misbehave, find the misbehavior. That's going to create, sort of an upper bound. It's not going to be ecologically valid. For other types of security experiments, it's even harder. So for instance, if we're looking at, phishing, for instance, you don't have people come to the lab and tell them to not get phished, because that's not what people do in the real world. You need to come up with some other task and then use some deception. So we had a bunch of other tasks, and we wanted to do this twice. So to get both the average case as well as the upper bound for the efficacy here. So first we had the unprompted misbehaviors where they were doing something else, the devices misbehaved, and then we observed whether or not they noticed those misbehaviors and interacted with the attribution mechanisms that we created. After they did that for both of the misbehaviors that I just mentioned, we then explicitly told them we're going to make the device misbehave again. This time, take your best effort to go through and figure out what apps are responsible, and also report with what degree of confidence you think it was a particular app. So the whole protocol was we randomized the number 1 and 2, so whether they had the wallpaper misbehavior first or the vibration one first. We had them, in the wallpaper case, we had them examine 3 different drawing apps. We chose drawing apps because drawing apps are just like, it's intuitive why a drawing app would have the ability to change your wallpaper. And so we wanted to create this ambiguity about what app could be responsible of the apps that are on this phone. If multiple apps have this ability, it could be any one of them. And in the second task, after they examined all 3 of these, so we were sure that all 3 of them were running on the device, we had them examine a widget on the desktop here. And the reason for them playing with this YouTube widget is because then we could be reasonably assured that the rest of the wallpaper was in view, at which point we changed it to Justin Bieber. And then we have them write reviews of the apps that they looked at to see whether or not anyone would comment about the wallpaper change in any of their app reviews, or attribute it to particular apps. When it came to the vibration misbehavior, we had them examine 3 different timer apps. Timer apps because, again, all of them had the ability to vibrate the device, and therefore there's ambiguity about what would be responsible if all of them were currently running on the device. And then the second task was playing with the dice app so that we could be assured that they were holding the device in their hands when all of a sudden it started vibrating incessantly. And then again, we had them write reviews. After they did both these, we then told them that you might have noticed the misbehavior before. We're going to cause it to happen again, and please write down what app you think was responsible for each of these 2 misbehaviors. And then we had an exit survey to gather qualitative data. So looking at this, with the vibration, the attribution mechanism was the icon in the notification bar, which they could pull down to see the name of the app. 80% of them, over 80% in the experimental condition, were correctly able to attribute the misbehavior when they had the attribution mechanism that we created, whereas only 30%, 31% in the control condition did so. Of the 4 apps that they had used at that point, so 31%, not indistinguishable from random guessing. Looking at the strategies, we had logs, we instrumented the devices to collect logs, where people were touching on the screen, what sort of information they expanded, and we confirmed that a vast majority of participants in both conditions looked at the notification bar. Of course, only those in the experimental condition had information there that was helpful to them. There were 12 who did so correctly in the control condition, as I mentioned, and in the exit survey, we found that 10 of them simply admitted to randomly guessing because they had no idea. 2 participants actually said they went through the process list and killed apps app by app until the device stopped, which is the only way of actually determining it. Regarding the wallpaper change, we also, again, found that they were significantly more likely to correctly attribute the misbehavior in the experimental condition. Again, the logs confirmed that they used the attribution mechanisms, but the overall numbers were a lot smaller. So in this case, there were only 34% versus about 8%. Now the question is, how does this differ from the expected value of random guessing before? Well, what we found in the exit survey is the reason why, this is actually, of the people who were, this is significantly less than random guessing. And the reason for that is because they were looking at the desktop and they saw exactly when the misbehavior occurred, they were much more likely to simply say, oh, it was the widgets, blame it on the foreground app, than they were to give up and just randomly pick something. Another interesting thing that we found was that a lot of people, up to 20%, attributed the misbehaviors based on the perceived abilities of the app. So without even looking at the list of permissions that had been granted, they just said, oh, I remember that this app had the ability to change the wallpaper, therefore it must have been the one. So what this suggests is that they're inferring abilities based on the UI features than the actual permissions that were granted, which is likely going to be incorrect. And then finally, when we asked them to specify the confidence rate, we found that there was a very strong correlation between having high confidence in their responses when they were in the experimental condition, whereas the people who even got it correct in the control condition through random guessing had very low confidence in those responses. So this confirmed a lot of our previous findings from the surveys on how likely attribution mechanisms are to succeed when implemented in this fashion. But there's still a lot of open questions. So for instance, with the wallpaper change thing, we added that to the settings panel. Users had to know to go open up the settings to see the annotation. Only about 30% of them in the experimental condition did so. even though that was significantly greater than those in the control condition, should that low number actually be considered a success? We say yes, because, well, one, as we saw with the data usage panel, it was in the same location, and after it had been out for a year, we found that about 75% of our participants were aware that it existed. This was brand new, the first time they'd seen it, so this is likely to increase if something like this were deployed and more annotations appeared in settings. The other thing is, from previous work that we've done, we observed that a lot of users infer the abilities from reviews, especially misbehaviors. So rather than first-hand accounts, they'll read reviews to read up on what experts think could be improved upon in the app, and that guides them in terms of what to install, which indicates that simply having a small number of savvy users who are aware of these features, they're eventually going to get disseminated into the average user. A good example of that is privacy policies, for instance. I mean, it's well established that most users don't actually read website privacy policies. Yet when there's something really egregious that changes, there's a small number of savvy users who notice that and it gets disseminated to the wider public. For instance, early this year, Instagram changed their privacy policy to say that they're going to be using images that you upload for advertising purposes. Now, one wouldn't expect the average user to visit the Instagram privacy policy every time they go there, but the day after they did this, it was in the New York Times, and it's obvious that it was because there was a small number of savvy users who noticed it and disseminated that knowledge. Another open question is if this is the way we're going to go with creating more attribution mechanisms, how do we distinguish between ones that are drawn by the apps, in that they can put any information in there that they want to misattribute behaviors versus system-drawn notifications, which are more trusted. Currently, in Android in the notification panel, those are all app-drawn. And briefly, before I finish, I wanted to talk about some future work that I'm doing right now. Or I could stop here and keep going. Okay. So the grand vision for a lot of the privacy and security work that I've been doing is from this observation that a lot of the previous work, especially in usable security, has been designing systems better for humans individually. We've improved things by leaps and bounds over the course of the past 15 years through human-centered design and figuring out how people are likely to react to various security mitigations. But the problem is we perform laboratory experiments or field experiments and distill those down into this idea of what the average user is going to do. But of course, no one actually fits the profile of the average user. And so the future work, I think, needs to look at focusing on individuals. How can we customize different mitigations to be more adaptive to different individual traits and behaviors? And this is probably, this isn't really that big of an ask right now because the amount of data that are stored on devices that can be used to infer behaviors and preferences is massive. So one thing I've been looking at with regard to privacy is correlating privacy behaviors and preferences with individual differences. One aspect of individual differences is personality traits. So I've been working with a cognitive psychologist on this, and one of the first things that we did was looking at a couple of the privacy indexes that have been widely used in the literature to see how well those correlate with different personality traits versus other types of individual differences, such as risk-seeking, for instance. One is, so the Weston Index, widely used, especially in computer science literature with regard to privacy. It mostly measures individual perspectives on how data is collected by corporations and the need for government protections about those behaviors. And we found that those people who score highly on the Weston Index as, say, privacy fundamentalists correlate with inversely with agreeableness and positively with, and also inversely with openness to new experiences, which are, these are the traits I have listed here are from the big 5 personality traits, which are widely used in the psychology literature. And we found that a lot of these different metrics actually correlate with different types of personality traits. And so future work is looking at how can we infer someone's privacy preferences based on observed behaviors, and then we can create adaptive systems that customize settings. So one next step in this area is I have a colleague at Facebook who I'm working with, and the idea is to deploy an app that is billed as a personality test, but it also examines posting behaviors, social, your social network, and tries to correlate all of that with the different personality traits. Because then, if we can automatically infer personality traits, and those might correlate to certain privacy preferences, we can create better defaults. So over time, if you've never gone and changed your privacy preferences, it's possible you're not aware that they exist, and so maybe the system could automatically change your defaults for you if you haven't explicitly stated them. And so that's where I'll leave it.